Welcome back, everybody. So today we're going to talk about the mysterious Salvatore Michael Caruana, who might be one of the biggest kingpins that you've never heard of. He disappeared 2 days before his trial in 1984, and he hasn't been seen alive since 1987. The feds tracked him down to a motel room in Groton, Connecticut, but he left before they arrived. They also found his van in a rest stop on a Connecticut interstate, but there was no sign of Caruana anywhere, and the van had been wiped down completely with no fingerprints or any trace of evidence. The feds suspect that he is no longer living, but it is still a complete mystery. The man just simply disappeared. Big shout out from longtime viewer David Fishwick, who brought this guy up to me as a request in the comments. I've heard of his name before, but I really didn't know much about him before I started researching into him to do this video. And it's one of those guys that just like blended in, was real low key. You never really heard his name as much as other people's names, but he was one of the major players during the 70s and 80s in the underworld. So shout out to David Fishwick. Like I said before, if I had money and I could do this thing like legitimately, he'd be the first person I'd hire to do research and stuff. Not for this particular video, but for a different Providence gangster. He sent me like a complete dossier of like links for newspaper articles, like photographs, like everything you would need to be able to do like a video on the person. So big shout out to you, David Fishwick. You're like one of my favorite viewers. Thank you for bringing this to my attention because it's a good story. So Salvatore Michael Caruana, although not a made man in the patriarchal family, had protection from Raymond Sr. himself and kicked up money to him, and had a close personal relationship with Raymond Jr., aka Rubber Lips, who took over control of the family after his father passed away in the early 1980s. So I couldn't find much about Salvatore Caruana's early life, where he hailed from. I assume he originally came from Rhode Island because of his close connections with the Patriarchas, but that's just a guess. All I could really find was that he lived and ran his operations out of Peabody, Massachusetts later on in his life. So Salvatore's first caller came in 1954 for armed robbery. Apparently before he got into the smuggling and trafficking profession, he was an armed robber. Armored cars, banks, any type of heist that you would need to be armed for a large-scale take, that he was into that. So he took his first caller in 1954 for an armed robbery. But then sometime in the late 1960s, early 1970s, he switched his profession into smuggling and distribution. So he was one of the biggest traffickers, not only in New England, but on the whole East Coast. And in the indictment for his trial, it was stated that he smuggled in over $173 million worth of Mary Jane there in the 1970s and 1980s, early 1980s. And to think about that, like $173 million for back in the 70s and early 80s, that is an incredible amount of money. That's probably close to like $500 million nowadays. So this guy was not small time, to say the least. This guy was like a major dude. So he lived in Peabody, Mass, which is like a city north of Boston. It's on Boston's North Shore. It's about a half hour north of Boston. Peabody is a weird city because like West Peabody, which I assume this is where Salvatore Michael Caruana lived, West Peabody is very rich. There's a lot of really nice big houses, estates. The more wealthy people live there, but then like South Peabody and Central Peabody is more just like working class, blue collar, you know? So there's like two different sides of the cities. So I assume that Salvatore Michael Caruana probably lived over in the West Peabody side where all the real nice big houses are and big properties, because this guy lived in what's described as like a castle-like fortress, and he ran his operations out of there. And he had vaults in the lower levels of this house that were built secure so he could hide money, financial documents, important documents that he didn't want people to see, weapons. He had like built-in vaults underground. That must have cost so much money to be able to build. But when he fled in 1984 and the feds came to find him after he skipped trial, they discovered all this stuff in his house. He also kept Doberman Pinscher dogs, guard dogs, and he trained them like they were vicious. And he actually set them on federal agents one time when the federal agents came to his house to serve him with a subpoena to appear in front of a grand jury to testify. He set the dogs on the federal agents, and one of the Doberman Pinschers actually bit one of the feds in the back of the leg, and they repeatedly kept asking him, "Mr. Caruana, call your dogs off." And he apparently, I read this, it's like he was charged by the FBI because one of the FBI agents was attacked by his dog, and it's actual FBI report that they kept asking him, yelling to him, "Please, Mr. Caruana, call your dogs off." And he sat there in his front door laughing and said, "I will not call my dogs off." He repeatedly said that to them. "I will not call my dogs off," all the time laughing and watching the show while his Doberman Pinschers tore apart the federal agents. Oh my goodness. So Sal Caruana and his wife and his children lived in this beautiful house in Peabody. He had a beautiful blonde wife that was described as like a blonde trophy wife named Sandy, and she was from Maine originally. Together they had 4 children. So he was known throughout Peabody by his neighbors and other people in the community to be like a really kind of flashy guy. He drove an old Stutz Bearcat, which is like an old early 1900s, like World War I time period, luxury like car, and it's very rare, and to be able to own one and drive one was really like a show of like how much money you had. He would always have like the brand new Porsche every year, like the Porsche would come out with a new model Porsche. You'd always have the brand new Porsche. He apparently had this like beautiful backyard set up with like a in-ground pool and a jacuzzi, and he had this built-in like jungle steam system in his jacuzzi area that you could push a button and this like jungle steam stuff would come out, and he just used to love to show off all these, you know, material things, and just he got a lot of pride off of being able to boast and show, look at what I have, look at all these things I have. So not only was he one of the biggest traffickers and smugglers in America at the time, but he was also into large scale money laundering and offshore accounts. He had like fake corporations and all types of bank accounts in the Bahamas. He was even said to have contact in the Bahamian cabinet, like the ruling government of the Bahamas, where he was paying this guy off and he was giving him money so that these guys were protecting his assets in the Bahamas, because this guy had hundreds of millions of dollars stashed away in offshore accounts and put into these fake corporations that didn't even exist. Caruana also had his own airplane that he kept at Beverly Airport, which is like a couple of cities over from Peabody, Mass. And he was like a licensed pilot, and he flew airplanes, and he had his own personal, I don't know if it was like a luxury jet like you think of today, but he had his own airplane that was about a 15-minute drive from his house that he could hop on and fly basically anywhere he wanted. Apparently, him and some of his rich friends, like this guy Tom Burns, who was a hotel executive for Sage Hotel Groups, and he became really close friends with him in Peabody. And this guy Tom Burns was also the youth hockey coach of Caruana's children, and it was alleged later that Tom Burns even had an affair with Sal Caruana's wife after Caruana fled and was on the lam. But these two guys both owned planes and kept their planes at Beverly Airport, and would like call each other and be like, hey, you want to go get lunch in Maine? And they would drive over to Beverly Airport, jump in their planes, and fly to Maine and go get lunch. I mean, this is what the type of like opulence these guys were living in, all with, you know, illegal proceeds from narcotics trafficking. So let's talk about that. So he had a pipeline straight from Colombia, Caruana did, and he was smuggling in, like I said, tons and tons of Mary Jane every year. Probably one of the biggest traffickers in the whole East Coast in the late 70s and early 80s. He had stash houses all around the Northeast that he would personally come and check whenever there was a large delivery, a new delivery, like a new stock would come in. He would come to those stash houses himself, make sure everyone was doing what they were supposed to be doing. He would sample, like look at the product, make sure it was good quality, make sure he was getting what he paid for, it was the right amount, he wasn't getting screwed on the quality. And his underlings say he was very hot-tempered, very volatile, and everybody basically describes him as this. This guy was not someone you wanted to mess with. They said he always carried a piece on him. You would never see Salvatore Caruana without a piece. He would always threaten violence. If you made a mistake, if you did something wrong, he would threaten to kill you. And these weren't empty threats. Like, people were afraid of him. Like, his workers did not want to mess with him. So this is where he kind of like got himself into a little bit of a problem. He bumped into Frank LePere, who was like the other biggest trafficker during the 70s and early 80s. And LePere had a deal that he was protected by Whitey Bulger and Steve Flemmi. He was paying these guys, he paid them like over $1 million over a period of a couple of years for protection and to make sure other people weren't going to cut into his proceeds and he didn't have problems with other mobsters or other dealers or traffickers. So apparently Caruana had a guy that was trafficking out of the Cape Cod area, and he was working for Caruana, and they tapped a source in Colombia that was primarily Frank LePere's source. So Frank LePere wanted to get paid for it. He said that he was owed $600,000 for him being cut out and them using his connect in Colombia. Caruana didn't want to pay, so LePere reached out to Steve Flemmi. Steve Flemmi called Caruana and told him, you know, you owe LePere $600. I'm calling on his behalf. And apparently, Sal Caruana got very loud, very angry on the phone, started screaming at Steve Flemmi and threatening him. Flemmi told him that he better be careful, that he does not want to make him angry. So apparently they had a sit down, and the sit down was at Sal Caruana's castle-like fortress home in Peabody. So Steve Flemmi was driven there by a cop who was like a crooked cop, and I don't know if he ended up losing his job later, but his name was Joe Mongilio, and he was working with Caruana as protection and with Patriarca Jr. So he drove Flemmi to the meeting, and Patriarca Jr. was in attendance there. He was kind of like the mediator between Flemmi and Caruana. So Flemmi said his piece, said that Caruana owed LePere $600,000 for using his contact in Colombia and not giving him the cut for it. At the beginning of the meeting, Junior Patriarca was on Caruana's side, and he goes, "I don't believe that he owes the money, this and that." And then Flemmi busts out, "Hey, did he tell you that Frank LePere over the years has paid him $9 million for the business that they've done together?" And apparently Patriarcha's jaw dropped. He had no idea that this type of money involved. He obviously was getting money from Caruana, but was not anywhere as close to these type of figures, and he was completely unaware that there was this type of money was being made. So he couldn't like hide the shock when he heard the $9 million. And of course Caruana started yelling and denied it. "I don't know, that's not true. That money was never getting paid. That's complete lies, this and that." So anyways, at the end of the meeting, Patriarca ends up ruling in favor of LePere and not Caruana, and says that Caruana has to pay $600,000, to which I guess Stevie and Whitey took $200 of it and gave the other $400 to LePere. So of course now, after Steve Flemmi and Whitey realize how much money that Caruana has been making from his business, they want a piece of it too. They decide that they're going to start to extort him like they do every other trafficker in the region. So they start cozying up to him. Caruana is going to travel down to Rhode Island to shake down some jewelry store owner, because he's also involved in like the gold business through washing some of his illegal proceeds through jewelry and gold. So he's got a jewelry store owner down Rhode Island that he's been working with. And he's going down there. He's going to try to, extort him or do some sort of business with him. So Whitey, Stevie, and Sal Caruana meet at the Howard Johnson's in Andrews Square in South Boston off the expressway, and the three of them drive down to Rhode Island together. So Whitey and Stevie kind of like step back, and they just kind of observe Caruana. So Caruana's dealing with this guy, and within a couple minutes, he gets real volatile, starts yelling at the guy. The guy starts talking back, and Caruana starts slapping him around. And Whitey and Stevie just kind of look at each other, and they end up going back. And after that situation of witnessing him in his demeanor with this jewelry store owner, and the way that he's acted aggressive before, and just they decided that they were going to back off Caruana, that this was not an easy mark like the rest of the traffickers that they had been dealing with. They realized that this guy was not somebody that you really wanted to mess with. And for Whitey and Stevie to say that and decide that we're going to back off this guy isn't a target for extortion, that really says something about how dangerous this Caruana guy was. To me, that says something, because there weren't a lot of guys that they backed off from back then. So basically, Sal Caruana would seem that he had everything going on. He had this huge house, every material thing you could ever want, beautiful wife, beautiful children. But then everything came crashing down. So I said, like, they were coming to serve him in the grand jury. There was heat starting to come from him. The authorities and the government was starting to pay attention to Caruana. So in 1984, he became indicted, and he was going to go to trial. So while free on $500,000 bail, which they said he easily made, he decided that the evidence must have been just too much, and he had no chance of winning trial. So 2 days before he was supposed to stand trial, he skipped town. At age 45, he went on the lam. And he was aided by Junior Patriarcha's underboss, wild guy Bill Grasso, out of New Haven, and he fled to Connecticut. And for a while, he lived in a condo under the alias of John Michael Hurley. So while Caruana was on the lam, he was still in contact with his old friend from Peabody, Ted Burns, the guy who coached his kids in hockey and was supposedly having an affair with Caruana's wife, Sandy. They were having some sort of computer correspondence, and when the feds came to the motel room that Caruana had in Groton, Connecticut, they found like an address book, and he had 8 or 9 different contact numbers for Ted Burns in there. So these guys were talking quite often. I don't know if Burns was helping him financially, or he was helping him in some way or form to stay on the lam and to keep his whereabouts secret. So while Caruana lived in the condo in Connecticut, he was being protected by Patriarca Jr.'s underboss, Wild Guy Grasso, and his crew. He lived there for a little while. He even had enough time to get a 34-year-old girlfriend and date her for a little while. But then that address must have come under heat, or for some reason they moved him from that condo, and the last known address that he had was a motel room in Groton, Connecticut. And when the feds found out about that address, they showed up, and it looked as if he had just left momentarily and could come back at any time. But upon further search of the room, they found rotting bananas and stuff, the evidence that he had been gone for over a week and that he probably was not going to come back. They also found his personal briefcase that had important documents, a loaded weapon, stuff that he probably wouldn't have left with if he was planning on leaving and not coming back. So the thought is that he was probably called to go somewhere with somebody from Wild Guy Grosso's crew, to go to a meeting or just to go do something. He left with somebody that he was probably familiar with, and that he never came back to the room. He has not been seen alive since 1987. The feds are asking people if anybody has seen or heard from Sal Caruana after 1987 to please let them know, because in their eyes, they think that he was probably killed by the Patriarca family and Grosso's crew out in New Haven, Connecticut. Apparently, a few years after that, they uncovered underneath a garage in New Haven, there was several bodies of men. One of them is thought to be the remains of Salvatore Michael Caruana, and also one of the other remains is thought to be his friend Ted Burns, who got wrapped up in all this and might have known too much information, and he might have been drawn out there and also whacked by the Grasso faction of the Patriarca family. Basically, Salvatore Michael Caruana became too much of a liability for the Patriarchas. He knew too much. If he went away, he was facing a possible life sentence for his role in the wide-scale trafficking. Back then, they had these really stiff penalties for being like a large-scale wholesale trafficker and distributor and smuggler of narcotics. They would give you life sentences for this, even if there was no violence attached to it. So they basically figured, with the inside knowledge that he had on the narcotics trade and with different members of the Patriarcha family, that facing a life sentence, he would turn and become informant. And there was already rumors that he had connections in the government, connections in federal agencies, and he might already be working in some sort of informant status, maybe not an actual informant, but he had some sort of connections where he could easily become an informant and turn on them so he wouldn't have to face a life sentence. So the Patriarcha family and Grosso's crew basically decided that he had to go. As far as I know, they haven't proven that the remains are his, and he is still, to this day, just considered a missing person. Hit me up in the comments and let me know if that's not true. I couldn't find anything on the internet if that they have actually found that those remains were his, and he is considered now to be deceased and no longer missing. But as far as I know, he's still considered a missing person. So this was a very interesting story for me to do. Like I said before, David brought this guy up to me. I really didn't know much about him. I had heard the name before. It rang familiar, but I didn't know like really the backstory behind him. And like I say, I'm always shocked when I find out stuff that there's still stuff that I don't know, like stories about certain mobsters or gangsters that I don't really know yet. So this was a fun one to make. I hope you guys liked it. If you liked it, hit the like button, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. Leave me a comment, make a request. But you know, guys, most of all, make good choices, make good decisions. Have a great day. Take care of your family, your loved ones. God bless. I'll talk to you soon.